Hi, my name is Blue04 and welcome to Level Design 102. Today we're talking about texturing. So today this is just an introduction to texturing. So first let's talk about what we're not talking about. We are not talking about making your own custom textures. I've dabbled in that a little bit, and the only thing I've learned is that making custom textures is a special kind of pain for people who really want to try to understand color theory using SRB2's really limited texture set, or limited palette. And the other thing I've learned is that making textures is a lot of trial and error and a lot of doing it wrong and doing it wrong over and over and over again. So we're not talking about custom textures today. And we're also not talking about a lot of specific tips and tricks. Today we're mostly talking about general principles and general rules. And so one thing to say about when we're talking about design principles, design principles are usually pretty hard and fast, but you can always break design principles if you have a good reason. If you're not sure if you have a good reason, you probably don't, so you shouldn't break the design principle. And that's just kind of a rule of thumb for design everywhere. You want to learn the principles, and then you want to, if you break them strategically. And, last thing I wanted to talk about, before we actually get into the meat of the video. So I am planning on, so this is an introduction to texturing. I'd like to go and do some stage-specific teardowns where I run through, like Techno Hill Zone 2 is a very well-textured stage, and I wanted to run through that and talk about it. Because there's a lot of specific tips and tricks that Ever uses that are really interesting. But yeah, so today we're starting with Sapphire Falls. So Sapphire Falls has been in the game for a long time, and it's looked like this for a long time. So the first principle that we really need to talk about is essentially good texture usage in a stage. Good texturing is all about contrast, but specifically it's about contrast of edges. So the point is to be able to create geometry in your stage, and then to be able to communicate your geometry as readable so that your players can understand the shape of your stage very, very quickly. Sapphire Falls was it is designed as a match stage. I'm just here alone because that's what I do. I just play stages to learn about them when they're not made for the game type that I'm in. But so the ability to discern the stage quickly and to understand what's going on quickly and easily is especially important in the fast-paced game type of match. It's a little bit less important in single player, but, you know, it's still good practice. And so the first thing we need to talk about is this idea of background versus foreground textures. So the first thing you'll notice is that, so this is using the Green Hill Zone set, but in the background we have a darker, almost brown texture. And the darker, almost brown texture is, it's a pretty easy staple in the texturing world of SRB2 because it denotes the far edge of the play space. So everything that's orange, that's stuff you can jump on. That's stuff you need to know about. That stuff, those are objects. There's stuff on the other side of them. That's foreground. When you see this texture means this is the edge of the play space, that's background. And so when you have these objects, so when I stand over here and look this way, there's a really, really easy silhouette where you can tell these are objects in the play space I need to care about, and then the brown stuff isn't. So you just know brown stuff is just the edge. And so it's like, so the silhouette goes like this, and then it travels upward and then around. And so you have this very clear edge that you can just read. And so the other thing that, so Sapphire Falls, one of the things that's really, really notable about Sapphire Falls is that Sapphire Falls has this really well-articulated edge right here, this grass. So whenever I'm looking up, so let's say I'm standing here and there's orange on orange, I can still see this edge and read it really, really clearly because of the grass at the top. And so So the grass at the edge at the top of the walls really, really articulates the edges clearly. And one of the things that I think that Sapphire Falls does that I actually haven't seen very many other stages do, that I just wanted to call out because I think this is really novel, but also really simple. So with the grass set that Sapphire Falls is using, there's actually two grass textures. There's the plain and then there's the checkered. And so when you're looking downward, because you know you're playing match and you want to see what's going on below you, the contrast between the plain and the grass, the plain and the checkered texture really makes this easy to read in terms of where the edges are. So there is this middle texture here of this grass, but my experience is that if you're so here I am looking at this edge right here, and the grass doesn't really actually help me understand that, but the difference between the plain and the checkered texture does. And so this is an extra dimension of readability that I think most single-player stages aren't concerned about, but I think this is a really nice touch. Yeah. I think that's everything we need to talk about. And so all of this put together is just that Sapphire Falls is just clear, it's readable, it's got good contrast. You can just understand this really quickly and really easily at a glance. But let's talk about Sapphire Falls actually does break my principles in one specific way, and that's something that we should talk about. So I'm just gonna jump really high for you. So Sapphire Falls has these ledges up here. So earlier I said that these background spaces, they marked to the edge of the play space and there wasn't actually anything up here. It turns out that there's some extra platforms up here that Tails and Knuckles can get to. I think... actually, maybe Sonic can't get up here. So these are just, again, in the context of match, I don't play Ring Slinger very much, so I'm not the right person to tell you why these are here. But these are just this extra hidden bit of functionality that is a little bit more for experienced players, and the edge here is just not articulated. It's really easy to miss, right? And I think that's important because it preserves the contrast of the stage generally. And again, there was a really good reason to break this rule in the design of Sapphire Falls. And so for me, this is an example of taking a design principle and then breaking it meaningfully with a good reason. I believe Sapphire Falls has been like this since I remember trying to use a texturing strategy like this one back in 2009. So Sapphire Falls has been basically like this for maybe 10 years, maybe longer. So now let's head over to Meadow Match and we'll talk about what texturing was like in 2005. No, I'm bad at writing console commands today. So Meadow Match is basically, this was the standard of texturing when I joined the community. I started playing SRB2 in about 2006, and this is kind of just what the game looked like. And oh my gosh, this is the old Greenflower rock. Gosh, wow. So this is the Greenflower, this is the GFZ rock texture from 1094. There's, I've been working with the Greenflower set recently trying to figure out what I can do to make it different. And so it's like there's, oh my gosh, yes, this brings back memories. So I guess I haven't, last time I was here I did not look at it hard enough. So in terms of what's going on here, the one thing I wanted to call attention to two things. One is this whole middle texture that's happening here. So when I'm at the edge here looking upward, the middle texture sort of helps articulate the edge, but it's a lot weaker than actually building that edge into the top of the wall as well. And so I think that this starts to interact, with those design concerns, but it doesn't actually address them very well. And then the other thing to talk about is that the foreground texture and the background texture are the same here in terms of this is the foreground texture, this is the background texture. So one of the things that, like, I mean, people talk about textures repeating really, really quickly, and that being something to avoid, and I think that there's probably a good reason to talk about that, but the thing for me that's interesting as I look at this is that, so the squares are bigger here and the squares are smaller in the background, and so I can kind of tell, based on the size of the squares and the texture, how far away from me the wall is. I'm also playing this at 1080p. I mean, I'm uploading the video at 720p, but I play SRB2 at 1080p nowadays, and so I can see the squares in the background fairly well. When I was playing SRB2 the first time, I was way back in, again, 2007, 2008. I was on a 1280 by 1024 monitor, and I may have been playing at the native resolution of 640 by 480. So partly I'm looking back, and I'm looking back on the design of 2005 with a screen and a monitor and a game that's much higher fidelity, looking at the same assets. So so I think that even though this texture repeats really, really quickly, I think it actually does help me understand the space. So why is that a meaningful insight? Well, let's go over to Greenflower Zone Act 2, and I'm going to go complain a little bit, because I think Greenflower 2 actually gets this wrong. And so I'm going to go run real fast to the very edge of the stage using Metal Sonic. And when I get to the edge of the stage, I will go complain about why I think that Greenflower Zone 2 has kind of an awkward solution to that problem of a background texture. So, alright. So this is our stop. So what's happening here, let me go back to being Knuckles. So what's happening here is basically there's two sizes of Greenflower rock going on here. The texture that I am on right now, the individual blocks are 64 big, and then the texture that I'm on right now, the blocks are twice as big at 128. And so when you're standing here and you're just looking around, right, the texture repeats slower, and then you have this extra, you have the extra checks that are just around that sort of help to break up the texture even more so that your eye has something to look at. But I don't think that you actually get as good contrast with the... So basically the idea is the foreground texture has blocks that are 64 big. The background texture has blocks that are 128 big. So when I stand about here, look at that. That's about the same size in terms of this block visually is about the same size. I'm going to fall off. This block in the foreground texture is about the same size as the block in the background. So when I'm standing here, it's kind of like, well, I can't actually read this edge very clearly, because it just kind of blends together, right? Basically I'm relying on the parallax movement of the textures to be able to tell me where the edge is. Which is fine, and one of the challenges of Greenflower Zone is that basically you have this legacy texture set that we just looked at, where you have this really boring set of just these two squares of two different colors repeating over and over and over again. And how do you bulk that set out so that it's interesting and it looks good, but it's still faithful to the original? And the Greenflower Zone that we have today is trying to answer those design concerns while staying essentially faithful to the look and feel of the original as much as it possibly can. And so I would actually argue that it's part of the design scope of the current Greenflower Zone that you don't change the background texture and you leave the background texture about the same color as the foreground texture. Because that's just part of what I'm not part of the dev team, but as someone who's been following the game for a long time, I think that that design decision is part of retaining the history of the stage. However, I think that the background texture here is just not helpful in terms of it doesn't clearly articulate the foreground elements, which is something that I really need in terms of reading the stage. So that's a little bit of a rant. I think that, yeah, I don't think this is a super elegant design solution, but I kind of understand why I have it. Because basically, so just a little bit of a breakdown here in terms of what elements are in the foreground that need to be articulated. This set of steps is foreground element. The ramp coming off the slope, that's a foreground element. This little upcrop is a foreground element. And those high platforms in the background are a foreground element, and then that's a foreground element. And that's just difficult to pick out. So, you know, again, Greenflower had good reasons to do this, but when you're designing your own stages, think about, and again, you know, maybe using the background texture there would be a good decision if you wanted to hide this cliff, right? Just like Sapphire Falls did. But when you're designing your own stages, think about what information should be easy to gain at a glance, and what information do you want the player to have to work for? Because yeah, this is a little bit much. Okay. So let's totally shift topics and head over to Deep Sea Zone. So Deep Sea Zone. So let's talk about materials. So what's going on with Deep Sea Zone is that Deep Sea Zone has this strong architectural texture set. Here, let me get a ring. So Deep Sea has a very strong architectural texture set with a strong language of squares. So I'm standing on tile. And here's some square accents, and there's this sense that what I'm looking at was actually built and actually made out of stone. And so when you're working with a texture set, one question to ask yourself is, what is it made out of? And how does the shape of, like, so what, the material that you're working with, what shape does it take? And so Deep Sea Zone has this strong square architectural texture set that is basically communicating a material that's made out of squares. And so the square materials create square forms. And so whatever material you're building with, whatever material you're texturing with, the question is, what forms does that material want to create? What material is that texture suggesting? And again, SRB2 is a Sonic game, and so things can be a little bit abstract. And so if you're suggesting a pipe, you don't need to actually necessarily know what a pipe looks like in real life, but you need to kind of understand what's the purpose of a pipe. So here we, and also just kind of as this extra highlight, one of the narratives of Deep Sea Zone is that all of the temple construction here is just old and it's just in decay. And so this texture right here, again, this is not necessarily intuitive, but this is the, oops, you're looking at the inside of stone texture. And so the idea is, there used to be this, I guess this isn't that symmetrical. So the idea is this used to be paved with some kind of material continuously, but just over time, this just wore down, and so this part of the wall is gone, and it was just ripped out. And when you're looking straight up, right, you can kind of tell this room was supposed to be symmetrical, but the part on the left is just gone now. Whereas in contrast, Deep Sea, with the rocks are more of a natural palette, and so the natural palette creates natural shapes. And so this back here is a fairly good example of the rough geometry that the natural cave rocks create. But actually, in terms of how Deep Sea uses the texture, the brown rocks for the cave are actually more of a background material, and so they tend to be rather flat in terms of their geometry. There's a few exceptions, like Sometimes there's stalagmites, and and there's this slope here. But generally, this is actually treated as a background texture, so it's actually not very interesting. It doesn't actually have very much cave geometry, but generally materials either fall into some kind of square architectural material, or they fall into some kind of natural material. And my own personal preference as a stage designer is I usually like to include both architectural and natural materials in my stage, just because I think that makes an interesting contrast that gives the stage a little bit more fullness. And again, that's just my own preference. Sapphire Falls was exclusively natural materials, and so it sort of had a very basic Sonic standard shape. And so let's head over to Greenflower Zone 1, because there's kind of this elephant in the room that people kind of know intuitively, but it's worth mentioning. So when you're looking at the Greenflower Zone textures, when you're looking at the Greenflower rock, and actually this is GFZ wall, but whatever. When you're looking at all these textures, these look like these very square, hard, very rectangular textures. And then the stage is just completely natural forms. And so when you're looking at this rock, basically the stage isn't actually made out of the square bricks that are used in the texture set. And that's really unintuitive. And the reason why is because basically we've all kind of agreed that, like in the way that Deep Sea had these sort of organic, natural rocks at the edge of everything, we've kind of agreed that, in Sonic games, this rhythmic geometric texture symbolically stands for rough cliffside rocks. So whenever you see a texture like this, that's just very rhythmic and geometric, and that makes up the entire stage, the stage designer is basically allowed to just say, look, this is symbolic for a rough cliffside texture, and this is a Sonic game, and that's a Sonic trope that has been in Sonic since the very beginning, whatever. I'm just going to design an organic stage using a rhythmic geometric texture. Again, something you probably already knew and already understood, but hadn't really realized that was there. For me, that's just a weird. And well, I mean, again, this is not a racing stage, but when I designed a nuclear sunset zone, I used the Greenflower Zone set, and I actually treated it as a very architectural material rather than a natural material. But then I use it as a natural material as well, and that's awkward. Using Greenflower set as both an architectural and a natural material. And there's a few small flourishes where sometimes the Greenflower Zone set actually is treated as an architectural material. And so, like, let's check out... I went way too far on the stage. So, let's go back here to the very beginning for this guy. So this little hut, it's not the right word, but this little hut is very square in a way that the rest of the stage isn't. And so this hut uses the Greenflower Zone rock as an architectural material in a way that the rest of the stage doesn't. And it's so small that you probably hadn't noticed it or hadn't really paid attention to it, but this is kind of one of the, I guess I would call it one of the struggles of having a material that's so square and architectural, but then using it in a very natural way. That you kind of just fall into using that material in an architectural way sometimes, and it's just awkward, right? It's like pointing out that the Emperor is wearing no clothes. But I will say that for the most part, whenever Greenflower needs a square object, it uses this texture instead, which is different. That's everything in my outline to talk about. There is, again, texturing is sort of this, it's a discipline where you get better at it through practice, and you get better at it through learning and looking at other people's stages. After this, I'm hoping to make some advanced texturing videos where I run through stage by stage and give you a breakdown of some tips and tricks that individual mappers use on their projects. And part of my reason for wanting to do that is because that's research I need to do as well, because I just think Techno Hill Zone 2 and Castle Eggman Zone 2 are these very well-textured stages that I just need to go and sit there and understand for myself so that I can come and tell you about them. But that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching.